Welcome back to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, where you'll find information on what's going on the North Fork of Long Island. We'll be focusing on issues and opportunities going on in the community, as well as people and stories from the present and the past. I'm your host, Christopher Bianchi, and for episode 35, our guest today is former Southold Town Supervisor Scott Russell, and we talked to him about his ancestry and his time growing up on Long Island and how he got interested in civics and politics and made his way to working at Southold and becoming the Southold Town Supervisor. We also talk about the future of Southold and some of the issues. So I hope you enjoy episode 35 with Scott Russell. This episode was recorded March 7th, 2024. Thank you so much for coming on to the podcast today. I look forward to talking with you.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm excited to be here, and I look forward to a discussion. Very nice program you have set up. So
thank you. So to just start off, firstly, just where you were born and raised.
I actually was born in Nassau County, in Freeport. Spent the first part of my life my family lived in North Belmore, the Belmore, Merrick area. We actually moved out when I was 12. That was the summer of 1976. So I started Mattituck High School in the 7th grade. Obviously, that school has, when I went, kindergarten through 12th grade were all essentially in the same building, with the exception of the 4th grade, which is down at Gutchalk. But, started in the 4th grade, in the 7th grade. So it was a brand new, opportunity for us. And we stepped in the fall, which was a little easier, I think, than to step in through a mid-year somehow.
And to go back from there, you were living in Nassau County, and I guess your ancestry going back from there past your parents, do you know when they came over?
Yes, but on my mother's side, both my grandfather and my grandmother came from Sweden, and that was around 1914 to 1920, something in that range. My father's side, my grandmother came over from Sweden, and that was a little bit later. That was probably the 1930s. My grandfather, on my father's side, came over from Scotland. He passed away before I was born, but he came over from Scotland, and that's where my last name's Russell originated from. So
yes. And did you get to meet any of your grandparents?
I was actually, my grandmother actually moved, when we moved out here, my mother's side, my maternal grandmother moved out with us. So she lived actually in Riverhead. My other grandmother and a lot of my family, actually, aunts and uncles and others, moved to Vermont. My family, actually, my grandparents and then my father started in Brooklyn, and then they worked their way out. And then they... Nassau County, and then my family kept coming out east on Long Island, and the rest of the family went to Vermont. One uncle went as far as Connecticut, but by and large, a lot of my family from both sides went to Vermont. I used to go up during the summers. I worked in my uncle's general store, sorting bottles. They had a 5-cent bottle deposit bottle system years before New York ever did. I went with my twin brother every summer. Stay with my grandmother for a few weeks, and Vermont was a beautiful place. So to have that as an option to go up and visit family as these short vacations on a regular basis was nice to have.
And did they say why they came over to the U.S.?
For everybody for the same reason. I mean, ultimately, opportunities in the U.S. were, much, much better and much more compelling for people than those in Europe. I mean, let's face it, even the Scandinavian countries at the time they just didn't have the prosperity that that the United States did. They didn't have the opportunities. My maternal grandfather actually was an interesting story because he was adopted. So although from Sweden, he spent a little bit of time living in Norway. He was working on a boat as a seaman and jumped ship, which is what they called it in the old days. You get to New York with your freight or whatever your boat is, bringing into the harbor, and he never went back. He jumped ship. He came, started life over here at the age of 14 on his own. Back in those days, maybe not as unusual. And then ultimately built probably one of the largest oil service burner companies on Long Island. So.
Wow. And then to your parents, where did your father grow up?
My father actually, he first was in Brooklyn. He actually had the distinction of living on Bedloe's Island, which was the island of the Statue of Liberty. There used to be 4 houses on the island. One was the caretaker, one was the security. Everybody had a function there. My grandfather, his father, was a handyman, largely on the gas lighting and everything. And he got to live on the island and take a boat to Brooklyn each morning for school. Ultimately, my grandfather got a job on the mainland side. They moved to Brooklyn, ultimately moved out to Nassau County. Both my parents went to Mepham High School in Belmore. My mother graduated in the later 50s. Her entire family went through Mepham. And then on my father's side, he went to Mepham, although he after that he moved on and went throughout the country. He did not the smartest man I know didn't go to college, but the smartest man I knew, and I'm sure a lot of kids say that, smartest man you'd ever meet. Went through the country, developed a lot of wonderful experiences, came home, volunteered for the draft, served his country, came out, and then became a police officer for Suffolk County. And quite honestly, that's how we came out here. We actually, we were, again, living in Belmore. And Belmore, Nassau County was getting awfully congested in those days. And, it's funny because he would drive through Merrick, very high density community, and talk about how it all used to be farmland when he was growing up. So I think that made me more sensitive when we moved out here. When you live in a high density area like Nassau County and you move out to the East End, you really develop a wonderful perspective on what it means and what the character of this community means and how fragile and how easy it could be lost if you're not absolutely diligent. So we moved out here. We were coming out in the falls. People probably don't want to hear this, but we were coming out in the falls buying pumpkins. But back in those days, there were very few pumpkin farms. We used to buy them, and then we'd buy a bunch, fill up the car, then go home and sell them on our front lawn in Nassau County. So weekend day trippers once in a while. And that's how my parents looked around and said, you know what, we want to live here. And ultimately moved out. My father commuted pretty far each day back to Babylon, but they wanted to move out. They wanted more of a lifestyle that wasn't so congested, and a school district that was top notch, which was Mattatuck. So.
And could you describe a little bit growing up though in Nassau as a child?
It's funny because in Nassau, when we moved out here, boy, was I mad. I mean, I had my friendships. I had, between Scouts and Little League, I had a paper route. You couldn't have a paper route out here unless you had a license and a car, I walked door to door, delivered papers every afternoon. And I put, money in my pocket as an 11-year-old. It was a wonderful place to live up. We happened to live on a dead-end street. You went out in the streets. After school, all the kids just went out and they played, whether wiffle ball or whatever it was, kickball. And there was no planning. There was no play dates. There was no this. There was no that. There was just going outside, going out the front door, see who was around and everybody that was playing, and we'd figure out what to do, whether it was tag, whether it was this or that. We got a little older and it was walking down to the little village of Belmore, which was what they call Bedford Avenue, and wasting money on candy bars and things like that. So, it was very interesting. Everything was within walking distance. I have a lot of fond memories from that. And when we moved out, I was very mad. But by the end of the summer, I developed, I could say, a genuine affection for this town. And probably midway through the seventh grade, I was really glad we moved out.
So,
I was in a school where you got to know everybody in your grade pretty quickly.
yes.
You didn't get that in Nassau County. And graduating class at just a school like Metten was probably 600 kids. So I moved out here. We had one of the larger classes in Mattituck, and in those days it was about 134. And that was like a huge class compared to most of them.
Yes. And then you mentioned a bit about why your parents moved out here, but were they even looking at the South Fork at the time, or they were set on the
I never remember visiting the South Fork, looking at the South Fork, or anything even remotely related to the South Fork.
Mhm.
We'd come out on this side, and we'd, again, a couple of fall weekends each year, ultimately, till my parents said that's the lifestyle they wanted, particularly for the kids, for us.
Mhm.
Four boys. We had four boys, all from when we moved out. My twin brother and I were in the seventh grade. Then I had a brother in the 10th, and my oldest brother was in the 11th. So,
So while you were out here, you came out seventh grade,
seventh grade.
and through that time, you said kind of explain what you did for fun in Nassau. What did you do for fun out here when you?
Of everything that you couldn't do in Nassau. Fishing down the road, fishing with friends. I got to meet people and make friendships very quickly. Certainly, you had your sports programs and things like that. Didn't participate a whole lot because there was so much to do through the school. And when you're playing little league, or something, your mother's driving 7 miles or your father's driving 7 miles to get you when the meetings are over. And don't forget, we moved out with four boys, so there was a lot of activity, and we all didn't necessarily like the same things, so they were
Mhm.
going nonstop, and you had to make choices. But the school offered so much that most of the activities were through the school, and whether that was through any type of, like, for what they call the variety show, things like that. Stuff I was a bit hammy in those days, and frankly, probably can be accused of still being hammy. But and then sports. I mean,
Mhm.
my family comes from a family of wrestling, so wrestling, that was. I mean, a lot of the weekends, a lot of the time, we were away wrestling in tournaments
Mhm.
throughout the Northeast. So, and that stayed with for a while.
And kind of through this time in high school, could you describe a little bit how Mattituck felt, or just even, I guess, considering Love Lane and that area, what it felt like at that time when you were.
It's funny because Love Lane went through, it was quiet, but it had businesses. It had a couple of delis that were just absolutely wonderful. It had, just remember distinctly, and a lot of people that grew up with me, and, within, probably 10 years either way, would remember a store called Schnitzel's, a guy that used to sell these beverages. And then there was a couple of delis. It was actually a nice little, village. It was robust for a small town. Then it went through a period where it just absolutely became dormant. There was a few businesses that were very good by the yard, and a couple of businesses I knew the families well who did well. But by and large, that was a very almost desolate place until it went through the Renaissance. But again, in high school, everybody in your class is a friend. I mean,
Mhm.
you have your very good friends, but everybody's a friend. And, if I go to an all classes reunion or something right now and I see someone, even within a few years of my grade, you have those long, in-depth conversations. You knew all about them when you were younger, and you're catching up. You're catching up with a friendship.
Mm.
You don't go to a reunion, look at someone, and say, I don't really know them, so I'm not going to engage with them. And I'm talking about people within 4, 5, 7, 8 years. You knew people. So,
Mm.
of course, I had older brothers, so I knew a lot of their friends. And back in those days, juniors were friends with the eighth and ninth graders. Everybody was sort of one big, and I hate to use maybe a word that tends to be a little trite, but everything, was almost like a family. Everybody
Mhm.
were friends. So,
And then while you were in school, in high school, did you have a role model that you could think of outside of your family? Um,
Outside of my family, obviously my father was the pinnacle of role models.
mhm.
He was just a great man with a really great sense of integrity and his own set of internal rules that was subscribed to a very moral code. And I don't mean moral in that almost in that sense about religious
Yeah.
type of thing. I mean moral in the sense of how you conduct your life,
Hmm.
what is right and what is wrong, and that had a lot to do with how you treat people. But outside of that, yes, I had some role models in Mattatuck. A couple of wrestling coaches that were more than coaches to me. They were teachers. They helped me a great deal. They helped me a great deal to the point where one of them was finding me summer employment because again teachers got very engaged with the kids. I had that wrestling element in common, and although they were coaches and the season ended, they were still taking wrestlers who were interested to wrestling tournaments even in the summer. They had a real dedication and commitment. I had a lot of wonderful teachers, so I
Hmm.
think everybody can say that a lot of wonderful teachers that many people in this whole community know.
Hmm.
So I could sit here and probably for a half an hour talk about how much each one meant to me. Those are two, Bill Nicole and Dave Darrow, who stood out. Frank Kioski actually was a former town trustee who was my science teacher. We have a preserve in Mattatuck named after him. He had given me that real awareness of the local environment and actually had actually recommended me for, and ultimately I was appointed as student representative to the North Fork Environmental Council, very large, robust organization at the time. So he was the one that introduced me to the environment and have an appreciation for it. So,
Hmm.
and there are so many others I can
Yes.
mention.
And then also during this time, do you remember any other events vividly or major events going on, I guess, on the North Fork? I mean, people might remember stuff within the U.S., other major events in the U.S., but was there anything on the North Fork that's something of a major event that you remember?
Well, look, the major events were the summer events like the Strawberry Festival. It depends on how you define event. The
Hmm.
Strawberry Festival had been going on for years, very different than what it is now. It was a one-day event held at the high school, and there wasn't, for the most part, rides or things like that. There were vendors, though. But major events, every major event was generally tied to a national event. So
Mm.
it wasn't necessarily unique to Southold. None that I can think of, because most of them would have been tied to national events. But there were some of these things that would take place. Cutchogue Lions Club would have a festival in the Cutchogue West School each summer, and then you had Strawberry Festival and all these other events. Fire department's been having carnivals for years,
Mhm.
which is where I spent an awful lot of time and money when I was young. But I can't recall any specific events that were
Mhm.
unique to just Southold.
And while finishing up high school, did you know what you wanted to do coming out of high school?
Yeah, I had set on going to law school. I was anxious to rush through college so I can get to law school. And went through college, transferred. I had started at Binghamton and then transferred down to George Washington University in D.C. I always had an interest in politics. I ended up becoming a legislative aide for a congressman, worked on Capitol Hill for 2 years, enjoyed it,
Hmm.
but I think at the time, I still had an interest in politics, but I never envisioned running for office, certainly at the local level. At that
Mm.
point, I planned on going to law school. Took a year off. My father said, "Don't take a year off, Scott. If you take a year off, you'll never go." He says, "Go right away." And I told him I needed to, re-energize, charge my battery and my bank account. And he
Mm.
said, "Don't go. Don't take off. Go, go, go." And I did not go. I took that year off, and here I am, 60 years old. Never went to law school.
Then, when you were deciding on going to college, you said you went up to Binghamton,
Yes.
but at that time graduating high school, did you want to kind of explore or leave the North Fork at?
Yes, without a doubt. My biggest problem coming out of high school was indecision. I had a couple of nice opportunities at a couple of different colleges, ROTC scholarship, which let me go to several colleges that had an Army ROTC program, wrestling scholarship, a couple of other things, and several colleges. I couldn't simply decide. I mean, that was what it got down to. I thought, let me go to Binghamton. It was a great school. Let me go there for a year and then try to identify what I want to do. And it's exactly what I did. I went to Binghamton and ultimately chose to live in Washington, D.C. And living in Washington, D.C. meant going to George Washington University. And invariably went back to Capitol Hill, and, it worked out very well for me. So.
And what year was that when you were in? How many years were you in D.C.?
I was in Washington, D.C. 3 years of college. I worked on Capitol Hill for 2 years, a little bit of an overlap. Part of my, the last 2 or 3 semesters were through the school, where I was still at school, hadn't graduated yet. And then after that, I did stay on until the congressman I worked for retired. So a little bit of overlap in my last year.
Okay.
But then, I stayed there. And then after a summer, after he had retired, I had stayed for another several months, and then ultimately decided to moved back here, and then moved into Manhattan for a short time and worked for a law firm right before I ran for office here on a lark.
And you didn't want to stay in D.C.
Part of me did, part of me didn't. Part of me wanted to come back again. I was, D.C., like any city, is an expensive place. I thought, let me go home, bank some money. Let me go home. I'll live home. Bank some money for college. Re-energize. Wasn't necessarily too concerned about getting a career position because I was going to go on to a graduate program. And ended up invariably, like I said, moving to Manhattan for a little while. I went and worked for a law firm, then a second law firm. Came out one weekend, and running for office was an absolute lark. It was happenstance. Never a plan whatsoever.
And you started out as Southold Town Assessor?
Yes.
What year was
1990.
that? 1990.
1990.
And that wasn't something that was on your radar?
No, not at all. I actually was working in the law firm, coming out weekends, working for a local restaurant owner, owned several restaurants, a guy named Dean Blakey, who was very good to me. Working for him one weekend, Bob Scott, who's, I think, a retired assessor that everybody in Southold knows, a real popular guy. I was working with him one weekend, and for Dean, we were bartending, of all things. And he said, Scott, Fred Gordon passed away. Fred was a very popular assessor who had passed away from cancer. He says, we're looking to appoint someone to fill the position, a Republican committee. Why don't you put your name in? And I thought that was ridiculous. Here I am 25, 26. At the time I looked even younger. I just didn't envision them ever taking me seriously. There was a lot of people that applied to the committee that year for consideration. You went through a regular convention, you were voted on, and ultimately had to go through 2 ballots, and I was selected. Completely shocked. I ran for office that November, won, finished Fred's term. It was about 3 years, ran for re-election, and the rest was history. Was there for 15 years before I ran for supervisor in 2005.
And while you were a Southold Town Assessor, how would you describe the North Fork at that time? What kind of issues were they working on then? And I guess thinking about how it might have felt like at that time when you were working.
In those days, I think there tended to be a much wider chasm between property rights advocates and preservation advocates, and there was there was a huge gap between the two, almost to the point where there was a little bit of animus on both sides. And then there were these wonderful, and I had a foot in both camps. I was one of those that said we can reconcile both and we can have both. Preservation was a very important consideration. In those days, there was no CPF fund. There was no community preservation fund. So the only way to really preserve was floating bonds, which became expensive and not that efficient. You could float a $5 million bond, and $5 million was a lot of money in the early 90s, but you didn't really preserve that much. And there was only so far you could take that. And then the other way to preserve was rezoning, simply upzoning, going from 1 or 2 acre zoning to 5 acre zoning. And that was never going to go over either. And I think that's where a lot of the chasm and some of the animus started. Ultimately, I think the Community Preservation Fund did a lot to mitigate that, because the property rights argument about stealing, property rights through zoning no longer became pertinent, because you were buying. You weren't rezoning people out of their density. You were buying their ability to build, rather than rezoning and taking away that right to build. And I think that reconciled a lot of the issues for both sides. But the issues back then were legitimate. How do you create jobs? Legitimate. How do you protect the land and the community character?
Continuing a lot of the same.
Yes. That's 1990, 1992, 1994, and here we are in 2024. There was, at the time in early 1990s, late 80s, there was a bit of a paradigm shift in the economy in Southold. Generational farming was dying. The kids I went to high school with, they were going away. They were getting an accounting degree from BU or wherever they were going. They saw the quality of life that they could have in those cities. They saw the incomes they could have. And a lot of them were looking at home and saying, I'm not going home and working a tractor, dusk till dawn. And the generational farming was dying. Also the wholesaling, which a lot of the farms were in those days, just wasn't there anymore. It wasn't economically viable. Also, I think people discount how important Grumman was, and the closing of Grumman. Plum Island became a much more modest employer. So you have all these factors happening at the same time. So we had very little of an economic base. The town made a deliberate effort to move its economy over to tourism. It was a huge push for tourism. Dick Noncaro from the Cutchogue Lions Club, our town clerk's dad, very good friend of mine, and him and all these groups. And in fact, Southold put together a Norfolk Promotions Council with the intent on promoting this town and promoting tourism. And the idea was, we don't have a local economy, so let's create one by bringing money in through tourism. To an extent, a lot of the issues we have today were a result of we're the victims of our own success. Now the challenge is, can we accommodate all of the tourism we do have?
Yes. And you remember when some of the farms were changing over to vineyards and wineries?
Yes. There was actually, I remember when the Hargraves originally, I was, again, 12, 13 years old. I remember when the Hargraves first planted a vineyard. And, I was young, and it was not all that significant a thing for me, because I didn't matter to me what you were planting. But I do remember having being at a festival and a fair, and they were presenting information to a lot of people. I think a lot of people at the time said, "Oh, good for them, fly to fancy, that's never going to work," and they proved everybody wrong. But yeah, I remember that, and I remember I worked for the farmers. I remember a lot of potato growing. These are farmers that were growing 100 acres or more. I have a farmer up in Riverhead, actually in Laurel. He had, I think, 300 acres of potatoes planted. I went out and I cut cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, you name it. I still remember those days. I worked for the Krupski family, Albert, our town supervisor. There was a shift, at least a somewhat awkward shift from the wholesaling. I remember when we were cutting crates of cauliflower, they were going to Riverhead and being auctioned off. The the crates would be brought up to Riverhead and then they'd be auctioned off, or actually inspected and auctioned off by these retailers. But there was this awkward shift from wholesaling to retailing. A lot of it meant, sort of taking those farm stands to the next step. Very difficult process because, again, in order to make that viable, you need to get the tourism out here. And it took a while to do that. I remember when the Krupskis just got involved with pumpkins and they started getting away from potatoes and moved into pumpkins. And a lot of operations were doing that. So they were saying, we can't make it wholesaling anymore. We have to get to the ultimate consumer. That's for retailing. In order to make that work, we got to focus on tourism. So that's where there was a bit of an evolution.
And they had to pick certain products and not use, the potatoes just wasn't working.
Yeah, potatoes wasn't working,
And how was it working for Krupski on the farm?
Oh, I'm not even sure you could call it work. I mean, I worked for a lot of farmers,
Yeah.
and trust me, I worked out in some pretty hot weather, moving pipe and stuff. But when you work for the Krupski family, it wasn't working on a farm. It was almost working at day camp because Mrs. Krupski would have you call you in from the farm every hour or two when something hot was coming out of the oven, whether it was apple pie or pumpkin bread. They were a wonderful family to work with. Everything. Anybody that doesn't know the Krupskis, which I doubt are too many people. Anybody that doesn't know them, every story you hear about just how wonderful they were is true. They were a great family to work for. Albert was in college by and large when I worked there, but I knew Albert very well. And again, the whole family I just can't say enough about. The farm was small. It was not what you would look at today as a huge pumpkin farm like we might see in Laurel. It certainly wasn't choking up traffic. It was a very, very nice very nice operation, and somewhat unique in those days. There wasn't too many pumpkin farmers.
I think more of it on the South Fork.
Might have been, but South Fork, you'd be surprised how little agriculture they have in the South Fork.
Yeah.
Now that might have changed, and there might have been a lot more when I was younger. But when you look over there today, the agricultural is very little.
Yeah, they lost a lot.
Yeah.
And then so now, when you were Southold Town assessor, did you know that you wanted to get more involved in the Southold Town in terms of the board, or?
Again, when I was an assessor, after a few years, I was nominated to run for county legislator. That seemed to be a good move for me. Ultimately, as politics happens, after the nomination, about a month or two later, they had switched out. I had come out. I was supposed to run for something else. They put another candidate in. I said at that point, I'm not interested in anything else, so I didn't run. By 2005, my term was up as assessor. My term was up, and I had to make a decision. Do I want to run for another term? Which was... Look, let's be honest. I would have been reelected because I would have been unopposed. Those administrative jobs in those days never had any opposition. So I could take the sure thing and run for assessor again, reelection, or I could run for supervisor. I knew the issues. I felt like I had a lot of answers to the issues. Well, nobody has all the answers, but I felt like I can contribute. So I said, you know what? I'll roll the dice and I'll run for supervisor. You know what? It's time to move on one way or the other. Whether that means out of town government or whether that means stepping up in town government, taking on new issues. Again, if you told me when I graduated high school at Mattatuck that I'd be supervisor someday, much less this long, I never would have believed you. I would have thought you were crazy. The guy that handed me my high school diploma was Bill Rulin, who ultimately was a councilman and my deputy supervisor. And if you told me that that guy from the school board, who I had no idea who he was, that was handing me my diploma, would someday be my deputy and a colleague on the board, I just thought you would have been nuts. And then honestly, when I ran for supervisor, if you told me I was going to be there for as long as I was, I'd tell you, you were nuts. That it wasn't going to happen. Every step of the way, I'm completely surprised about the direction I went in. So.
And was there any, I guess we talked about some of the issues, but anything that you wanted to get involved in as the Southold Town supervisor that that was the first thing you wanted to work on when you got in.
The
Or a
comprehensive master plan. I ran on
comprehensive.
that. Yeah, the comprehensive master plan. We needed a new one. We had new challenges again because of that shift over to tourism and a lot of things that the earlier plan just didn't anticipate. And the reality is that earlier plan, which culminated in the zoning map in 1989, wasn't working. If you're talking about trying to promote investment opportunities to promote jobs, if you're talking about preservation in certain greenbelt areas, and you're fighting over it because it's not happening, your map is not working, your plan is not working. So it was time to update the plan. I would say my only disappointment was that the plan took as long as it did, but there was a reason for that. We did it in-house, and the plan was revisited over and over because even in the decade that we were working on it, the circumstances changed so often that we would go back and we would amend any particular chapter to accommodate for those changing and evolving circumstances. So there was some benefit to that time frame. Although it would have been nice to go a little bit faster. I think that there's a sound reason why we didn't. I think it's a great document. The one thing I'd like to see now is I think we need to start drafting. We need to start drafting code and getting public meetings together on drafting code. I appreciate the board's direction in hiring a consultant to go out and have more community meetings. My position is been there, done that. The community meetings should be based on black and white language of where we want to go with our code. I think that's where we need to be. We need to be in those rooms, not just getting concepts and ideas. We need to be in those rooms discussing the language that's on that paper to start creating code and to start developing maps and saying, this is the code we want to create. This is where we want to put it. And that is where the rubber hits the road. It's going to be contentious. It's going to be very confrontational to an extent. But it's also the whole comp plan means nothing if you don't get to that stage. And here, now, it's got to get done.
And so, like some of that, like you said, reaching out to a firm to do it kind of might delay the process.
No, it's having a consultant, I think, is essential. The question is, what are you asking a consultant to do? If you're asking a consultant to organize what they refer to as charrettes, these community meetings, to get input from how we should draft this, and how, if you're asking them to do that, that's fine. But that has already been done. It's been done too many times. So that's done. We have to now take that consultant and say, now we're going to draft code. We need a consultant, we need the attorney, we need the town board, we need all of the people in town government that have to implement that code and work with that code every day. We need them in code committee meetings, and we need to start drafting. We need to start drafting that code. We got the input, we got the concepts. Now any input you get is at those public hearings when you start going to adopt and implement that new code, that new map. The input will come then. It might be a little bit uncomfortable, but that's when the input should come. The community meetings are over, or they need to be over. That consultant or another consultant needs to now start help you drafting and writing, not talking. The talking is over. It should be over.
And then back to your time as Southold town supervisor, that you were working there over 18 years.
Yes, 18 years.
Because you said working on the comprehensive plan, but what would you say is your most proudest moment of what you kind of spearheaded over that time frame?
I'm not sure there's any one thing I could focus on. The thing is, when you're there that long, there's a lot of things you've done that, frankly, you forget about. And even the public forgets about. You forget that you bought the Pecana School. That was on the, that was on the chopping block. And you were able to renovate that to its historic grandeur. Yeah, it's something small, but it matters. You forget a lot of that. Obviously Plum Island had a pretty large and continues to have a pretty large role. But, I can't say there's any 1, 2, 3, or 4 things. It's the day to day. The reality is, for most people, there's a lot of people that have these issues that happen in their lives that might seem insignificant to you or to me, but they're really significant to that person. It's about the quality of life for that person. Plum Island isn't jeopardizing their quality of life. Plum Island isn't the most important thing to them. That thing that's taking place in their community, whatever it is, that is. And you better be prepared to make that your biggest priority. Otherwise, you're not doing your job. And frankly, doing your job is hard. You're saying no a lot. You're saying no to a lot of things because you either can't do it, it's unrealistic, it's financially untenable, or frankly, it's sometimes people ask for things that you're just not in a position to do. Either it's not the responsibility of government and we can't do certain things even if we want to, working on private property, whatever requests we get, or we have to refer you to other governmental agencies that have that responsibility and that we can't just assume their responsibility. You'd be surprised. But I've been asked that question so many times, and I'm trying to think of those few watershed moments, and they just, from my perspective, don't exist. You know, they don't. Those issues take place each and every day.
It's multiple
things
that happened. It's not just one big.
It's a paradox. It's really, really, really significant to someone out there, but really, really, really insignificant to others. You got to focus on the significant component, even if it means it's just one or two people or a small community group of 8 or 10. And I used to go out and do a lot of community meetings on Saturdays and things. A lot of, de facto civic associations or community associations, homeowners associations. And there were some issues that were very important to them. Some of them were important that were part of a larger perspective. The 80 acres under threat of development up in community, maybe in Mattatuck or something like that. That was a large, significant issue, regional in nature, and it was also important to that community. But by and large, I wish I could sit here and list 5 or 6 watershed issues but I can't. I can't. The administration of government, that's what I did. That's what I'm proud of every day. And if there's one thing that I want people to look back and recognize there's probably 3 or 4 things. Number 1, my accessibility. When you stopped me at King Cullen, I love the idea of you stopping me when I was out eating dinner and you came, because that means you felt comfortable enough to know that I was going to be receptive and that I could accept whatever you had to say. If it was a compliment, if it was a criticism, or if it was just a question. That I cherish the fact that people felt that way. I also hope people look back and say, you know what? I might not have agreed with the guy, but he worked really hard. We paid him a salary each year, and he earned every penny of it. And that's what I hope.
And you kind of mentioned a little bit some of the tough things that you had to deal with, but what would you say is the toughest part about when you were working as Southold Town Supervisor?
Some of the toughest was that there were a lot of these issues that as hard as you tried, you couldn't do a lot about. Helicopters for some time was very frustrating because I created a helicopter committee meeting. I was meeting with the FAA up at the airports up west. We just couldn't seem to move the ball and helicopters, we were getting killed with complaints and phone calls. And we just couldn't seem to get anywhere. Ultimately, we were successful, but it took years. The deer population. I started a deer management committee a decade ago. I started it with the input of Albert Krupski, and Jeff Standish, who was our commissioner of the Department of Public Works, oversaw and created that program. And we just weren't making inroads. It looks today like we're still not making inroads, but you have to look at it from the perspective where, we only take 3, 4, maybe 500 deer a year, but those are doe, and those does have offspring. So not only are you taking the 400 or 500 deer out of the population, you're also removing the potential for the amount of fawns that they're going to produce. And they're producing not just one anymore, they're producing anywhere from 2 to 3. Winters are milder, food is more plentiful year round, and what people don't understand is we're creating a perfect environment for them. Those fringe, people say, well, we're forcing the deer out from, we're developing and forcing the deer out. That's not necessarily true. Deer don't do well in woodland. They don't do well in open areas. They do well in fringe environments. And those fringe environments are these large type of parcels with plantings that are a buffet of food for them.
Mm-hmm.
And also the crops that we plant in the town. Some the biggest crops out here, actually, the biggest producers aren't wineries or vineyards or anything. They're what we call ornamentals. Trees, bushes, plants. Those are actually the largest segment. That and sod are the largest segment of the agricultural when you look at it from a income perspective and a lot coverage perspective. Those are probably the bigger crops. And those ornamentals and all those things, they're a year-round supply and a big struggle for farmers to stop the crop damage. It's an economic crisis that the deer are presenting, and obviously a health crisis with tick-borne illness. So
Yes.
that's been very frustrating for me. Code enforcement is also probably at the top of my frustrations.
And has there been some form of, well, even thinking back with the deer population, but also with the increase in farming, there's not as much space for them on that, and then you have to protect the crops. And is there some form of management or keeping, like, has it been tough keeping the deer population in check?
It's been very tough. It's been very tough. And again, the question is maybe not keeping it in check, because I'm not sure you can, but keeping the growth as small as possible. But you have to remember, people say, well, there's not as much space for them. No, we really have a lot more than we had for years, but things have changed, and it's created a perfect storm for deer to populate. People, don't discount mild winters. We're not getting the freeze over. We're not getting the snow coverage. The access to food is there for deer year round, and if the food is there, the reproduction is there. All right. They're also coming out in early spring. Again, they're not coming out early spring hungry. They're coming out early spring, after being well fed all winter, and they're not having that one fawn anymore. They're having two or three. So you have mild winters, you have changing crops, you have all of these things taking place. Paul Stoutenberg was probably one of the foremost environmentalists in Southold town. And years ago, he had said something which is absolutely true. He said, if you saw a deer, you went and told everybody in school that day. And I grew up, seriously, once the rare occasion we saw a deer, usually coming over from Robbins Island. And you went and told everybody, hey, we saw a deer walking across the ice today to Nassau Point, or we saw a deer that swam over. And you went and told everybody. Red fox and everything you saw so often, you took them for granted. Now it's the converse. It really is. So deer were really very scarce in those days. But there are so many circumstances that have made the environment almost perfect for them.
Yes, definitely. And back to just thinking about your time on the Southold Town board, just with when you first started and when you finished up last year. How was it working on the board with different personalities and different political affiliations? And do you feel that it's become more hostile environment? I know on the federal, I've asked other people on the federal and state level, it's very hard getting any bipartisan agreements done, and just kind of working in that environment on a town level, just trying to work together to improve the town and get things done without so much political.
I don't. When I first got elected, I was actually in what you'd call the minority. I was one of two Republicans, and I had a board of, and there were 4 Democrats on the board. So we had a board of 4 Democrats and 2 Republicans, and that was a very productive board. And I enjoyed working with all of the members: Tom Wickham, Bill Edwards, who I'd run for supervisor against, Dan Ross, and then Luis, of course, and I were Republicans, and and Albert. That was a productive board. Every board is going to have its flashpoints, and and I don't care if you're a Republican or a Democrat, or every board is going to have its flashpoints, and a lot of times it's maybe 1 or 2 members that feel strongly about an issue. But by and large, there's going to be a host of issues where you agree on. And that flashpoint between me and one board member might, then that board member, I might agree with 20 issues that come up after that, but then we have a flashpoint with another member or those two members. I don't see it driven by partisanship. I see it driven by strong views, and personalities tend to, the personalities tend to create the dynamic there. But strong views and again, personality creates the dynamic. But I do not see it as partisanship. And in Washington right now, there seems to be a deliberate, willful effort to not work on any issue. I do think here the effort is to try to work on the issues. Sometimes you're successful, many times there's, and then there's a few times you aren't. But I would suggest you could focus on the one or two things that were argued about quite a bit. But if you look at the agenda, there were 18 agenda items that there was perfect agreement on. So, what happens is the things that tend to be more confrontational, they get the attention. But all of the things that there was good consensus on, they're getting overlooked. And I think that's what it gets down to.
Yes.
So
they just would like to focus on those.
Oh, yeah.
Small.
I probably butted heads with Jim Denizio, who's a town board member, and a fellow is actually on a running mate of sorts. And I have to say, he and I, boy, we've known each other for almost 40 years. And we used to, but you know what? I consider him a good friend. Mm-hmm. I consider him and I to have a lot in common. But those few issues, boy, we really did disagree. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, we had a real underlying fundamental respect for each other that to this day lasts. So, and we agreed a lot more than we disagreed. And I'm only using him as one example. There's plenty of examples that are out there. But he's one example because he's, he is a good friend, and I know I can be candid about my exchanges with him and not have him get offended because it's almost impossible with him. But I consider him a good friend and have a deep, deep respect for him. And we agreed a lot more than we disagreed. Mm-hmm. But again, those disagreements, whether it was with him or two other board members, those disagreements, once they were resolved, if they were resolved, you moved on to the next one. Mm-hmm. And there was perfect agreement on.
And then you've probably gotten this question asked a lot, but how does it feel being the longest serving town supervisor in Southold? Now that you kind of look back on it, how does that feel?
It was never a goal. I never thought I'd be serving as long as I did. Some of that is happenstance. It's I evaluated everything. People said, well, when are you going to move on to higher office? And my position was, what higher office is that? I mean, I kind of feel like I had the highest office that you're going to achieve, which is supervisor of a town I love, in a community of people I knew well, a lot of people I knew well. I don't think there was probably any position that's higher than that. Assembly, and I've had my opportunities to run for these higher offices. Assembly is a great elected position, but it's just different. I wouldn't consider it higher. I wouldn't consider these positions higher from my perspective. Mm-hmm. Supervisor worked for me, so I stayed there. Or so, I had a family. And you have to think about, well, do I want to be in Albany half the week, or do I want to be able to make my kids' lacrosse game or CYO basketball game? Do I want to make sure I'm there to get them from school at 2:10 or whenever I had to pick them up? And the supervisor's position gave me those opportunities. Also, it wasn't that I was so formidable that I decided to stay there for 18 years. It was circumstances. It was, people that could have run against me that could have made me the shortest serving supervisor in Southold Town, but were out of friendships and others opted not to run against me. So that it had a lot to do with a lot of those things. It wasn't just, it wasn't like I came in and I was, Pat Vecchio or Huey Long. I mean, I was just, just right place, right time, and circumstances worked for me.
And with retiring from the Southold Town for the supervisor, why did you decide not to continue on and decide that I want to stop?
I think I stayed long enough. Some would argue I stayed too long. Probably have a compelling argument. I'm not one of those that talks about term limits. I think you have term limits. It's called the ballot box. I always find it ironic that people criticize you for being a career politician. When they run for office, they want to put an end to career politicians. But if they win, then in 4 years, their ad starts talking about how much experience they have in government. So there's a little bit of a hypocrisy there. But I think that it was, look, my kids have grown. One has moved. I expect another one to move. I just, it was time to move on. It was time for a fresh perspective. It was, and I knew that Albert Krupski was going to run. So I had stayed in touch with him. Albert, again, was my deputy, and I thought it was a great opportunity to. I thought it was time to put the role of running the town into someone else's hands, and I knew that I couldn't think of anybody that would be more equipped to run the town as well as Albert. So there was no unknown there.
Yeah.
And again, 18 years is a long time for any elected position. And it was probably, it was time to go. The public deserves fresh perspectives.
And then speaking we talked a little bit about issues going on in Southold town, what might have been happening in 2005, 2006, and through your career. But I'm just curious what you think moving forward. You mentioned updating the code, but in terms of maybe 3 other issues for the North Fork or the Southold Township, what 3 other issues do you think are important?
Oh, yes, tourism.
Tourism.
All right, tourism. One of the things I think that tourism needs to move over a little bit, because there's another game in town. There was a time for years, like I mentioned, that we had a plan to really bolster tourism as our economic savior. But we don't have to do that as much. There's a business community that's built around tourism. That's not going away. They're still dependent on tourism. We can't make tourism go away. We still need tourism. But it's not all we need. We actually have a new source of income, a new opportunity, a new economy. And that is, the pandemic changed the demographics of the town substantially. A lot of the people that were coming out weekends are coming out and staying. They're here 4 or 5 days a week. They're shopping locally. They're spending money locally. They're living locally. There's this whole new dynamic that a lot of them are earning their incomes from a laptop. But again, they're out here. If people started building business models around serving that community, they don't have to be dependent on tourism. And I really think that the town needs to start putting some emphasis through its zoning, through its code, through its incentives, through other means, working with the business community at promoting businesses, so that people that want to get into business can start creating these models around that. Tourism, there's a lot of externalities there. Tourism waxes and wanes based on economies, but a local population, it persists. And I think a lot of the models, if you're going to build your model around tourism, you're dependent on tourism. If you're going to build your model around a community that's expanded, then you're going to build your model around that. And I do think we need to encourage that. We keep focusing on tourism like it's the only game in town. It's not. It's a game in town. We need it. We can't undo that because there's so many models. But
it's not. Would you say that it's mostly a certain time of year too? Is when the tourism kicks in, so you lose some of that the other time of year.
Yeah, but there's that. A lot of the models though sort of shape themselves around that. Hey, we're going to start, but the season kicks off a lot earlier than it used to. When I was young, the season started, Memorial Day weekend, or really pretty much after schools were closed, because all the people that came out for the summers, they were coming out after the kids were done with school for the year. And Labor Day is when it ended, and that was like a hard deadline. Then it started extending out. Well, it wasn't Labor Day; it was October. It was, and then it started getting a little earlier. Now it's a much earlier spring and a much later fall. But there is that dormant time of year. If you start focusing on that year-round population, you have a robust opportunity year-round. But I would agree with you that there is a certain segment that when it's a downturn, which is built into the calendar, there's a downturn. Makes it a little harder.
For the people that live out here year-round, they don't have. There's businesses that are closed for that part of the year, and and then there's other things with housing and people that still might not be out here full time.
And there might be, if we can be more successful creating housing, things like that. But again, it's what comes first, chicken or the egg. We need the housing, but we need the jobs. We need the jobs, but in order to fill those jobs, we need the housing. So that's historic. That's not changing. But yes, I would agree that people that move out here, they have to surrender a little bit in the winter too, because those stores and those businesses that are closing because there's no a seasonal trade, they're not available for the year-round trade.
And what would you say is another issue?
Infrastructure. We have terrible. This town was not designed for the type of infrastructure and traffic that we're generating, and I get a lot of complaints about that. And it's not easy. It's infrastructure is very expensive. A lot of the roads are 2-lane winding roads. They weren't built for the speed of the volume of traffic, the volume of trucks. And a lot of people, I get a lot of complaints, and they wanted solutions done overnight. They want bike trails and all those things. Well, bike trails are almost cost prohibitive depending on where you are. Not bike trails, but bike lanes. All these things. Sound Avenue, the complaints about Sound Avenue, and I get it. I live here too. But at the same time, some of these solutions, you're going to so fundamentally change the character of some of these, some of this infrastructure. Do you really want the solution? Be careful, be careful what you wish for. But that's the nature. This community was not designed around handling the type of infrastructure and volume we're getting. It's as simple as that. I think we're accommodating a lot of that in planning as the site plans come in with new businesses. Where are the limousines going to park? Where are the buses going to park? Where's the loading and the unloading of the trucks for the busier businesses? And we do what we can on a site-specific basis, but that's not really addressing the larger issues. What's the capacity of the main road? What's the capacity of Route 48? Those are difficult challenges. Those are difficult. Some of them are probably not solvable. And I think some of the public's going to have to come to realize that some of the things they're complaining about, there is no solution to. And if there was, it would be either very costly or change the character of, do you really want that 2-lane highway which can't handle the traffic? Do you want it big enough so it can? I don't think you do.
No, and we've seen that in other places around the country where they have widened roads, and it doesn't, within 5-10 years they need to do it again. So it's not a sustainable option, and it does change the look of the area, and I don't know about other forms of alternative transportation. And it's not like Greenport is pretty walkable, but other places it's not. Even if you had more buses or had I guess more, that would be more for tourists if people want to commute on the train. It doesn't solve everything. It might help a little bit, but
it doesn't. The thing is, we had through the East End, and when I first got on, I was part of an East End Transportation Commission, which looked at creating this East End, almost creating our own MTA, East End MTA. The thing is that the one benefit of improving service on a daily basis, it gives people that live here access to good paying jobs out west. Okay. So look, Google's not coming to Southold. They're not building in Southold, but they're all good paying businesses up west. Giving people an easier commute to where they're going is probably good. It would provide opportunities for people that live here. But the converse is true. It also gives people that live up west the opportunity to live here, and that means possibly more housing. But yeah, you're right. It's not like you're going to bring in a shuttle service going to solve all the problems. And also, with regard to tourism, people are creatures of habit. It's going to be almost impossible to get them to hop on a shuttle and then come out and use the shuttle to get around town. You're right about walkability. It's a challenge. Is a lot of it is them having an idea of where they want to go, but they're miles apart. It's not so easy. But I can tell you that people want to drive to where they're going, and you're not going to change that habit overnight.
And just another issue, you mentioned housing and like land preservation. Do you think that for the housing, we can build more housing, but at the same time, we don't want to build it on these big plots of land and have kind of this more sprawl like that happened in west of here? But more smart, I guess sustainable, more, I guess you could say more compact, because when you look at we're very unique still,
right.
in the rest from the rest of Long Island, and whether people want to move out here or not, we might not want more housing in certain types of housing. And at some point, do you say that, well, we just can't, you can't take more people, or the people that come out here are the ones, whoever can afford it? Because then if you wanted to not build these big subdivision and you wanted to build more multi-family or 3-story or 2-story, some people might not want that level that you might be seeing in Riverhead, 5 stories, 6 stories. So there might come a point where you just can't take in more people at some point, or some of the, and then trying to work with affordable housing just to make sure for service workers, for having workers like that being able to afford to live out here because they're working for the town. But I don't know what you think about that.
The thing is the affordable housing. A lot of the proposals, it's almost again a difficult situation in that developers need a certain density to make affordable housing work. They can't get to the price point, they can't get to the rental point unless they can produce enough. Either build enough houses for sale or build enough apartments for rent. There's a formula they need to meet. Yet that gets to a density where, as a community, we're just not willing to accept. We're not used to accepting or to allowing these huge, high-density communities. And I don't see that happening or changing much overnight. Maybe the new affordable housing tax will allow us to support or to subsidize developers so they can build smaller projects rather than focus on a lot of housing in one spot, distribute it a little bit more easily, although that is very costly. It's a difficult challenge, but I will tell you that development, a lot of the development that's taken place still is development on existing building lots. Also, a lot of it is buying existing houses, knocking them down, and redeveloping them into large houses. So that might start changing soon as the market for available building lots that are already created and for the housing that is there's the potential for knocking down and rebuilding. As that inventory shrinks, people might start looking at subdivisions a little bit more. But for the time being, we're in a foot race, but we're doing well, but we can't let up, and we probably have to pick up the pace a little bit. I talked a great deal with the current supervisor about it, as we were, transferring. He's well aware of it. He stayed on top of every issue, so he knows that we're in a foot race. But again, there's housing versus affordable housing. We're trying to reduce or stop housing on this side and promote housing on this side of the equation, and both are equally difficult for completely opposite reasons.
Yes. Just so, as your time going to high school here and up till now, I was just curious, is there anything you miss about the way the North Fork used to be, or anything about the North Fork that you grew up with?
Um, I'm going to be honest, and this is something I say that's not always that popular, and sometimes it gets misinterpreted. But I think there's a demographic change that's pretty substantial, not just in year-round population, but also tourism. Tourism used to be more family oriented, and I
Yes.
I think we're seeing what we're seeing now is a tourism shift with very deep pockets. And believe me, I'm unaware of any circumstance where deep pockets hurt a community. So to come out and spend $45 for a lobster roll, God bless you. Thank you for coming, and thank you for spending $500 a night. We need you. That's great. But we still need that middle income. We need that family. We need them. A lot of businesses are built around them, and in order to survive, they're gonna need that niche. And unfortunately, we might be losing some of it because a lot of the accommodations are gearing towards that higher end income stream rather than the middle income stream.
Yes.
Why rent a room for $250 a night when you can get $650 a night? But also the year-round population. I think that there is, it's probably not geographic. I know there's a lot of people that are moving out, and it's probably not geographic. It might be more generational, but I feel like there's not as much emotional attachment to the community as there was growing up.
Yes.
People that lived in Cutchogue loved Cutchogue. People that lived in Mattatuck loved Mattatuck. They got involved with the different groups, and the groups struggle for memberships. The volunteer groups they used to be so big and so robust. Now some are, many struggle. Fire departments certainly struggle. And I do think there's almost an indifference to the existing community, that they're not moving out to a Southold that exists. They're moving out to a Southold that they envision it to be. We're moving out here. What do we want the community around us to become, rather than what is the community that already exists? And that's when we moved out. We loved the community as it existed. My parents didn't get involved in causes to try to change things. And I do think there is some sense of, well, we need this, we need that. Well, you know what? We don't. We had it, or the reason we don't have it is because, frankly, we don't need it. Enjoy what we have to offer. And I feel like there's an emotional attachment to that. In order to embrace it, you need to feel emotionally connected. And I'm not sure it's there. And again, that might be more generational than demographic. I don't want to say, hey, people are moving out aren't nice to Southold Town. But I do think there's a mindset out there, wherever the genesis of it is coming from. There's a mindset that says, Southold needs this, Southold needs that, rather than focus on, hey, Southold has this and is this. And that's really wonderful.
I think that is something that people have talked about, and just with, well, I'm coming from here, this is how this should really be run, or we should actually have this, and then just saying, how can I help, or this, I'm happy to be out here.
Right.
And then just over your time here, it might be a little bit of an overlapping question, but just over your time here, what have you enjoyed about living and working on the North Fork?
The intimacy of it. I happen to be one of the luckiest guys in Southold Town. I worked at a job that not only was I engaged in my community, I worked for everybody in this community. So my job was a broad sweep. I got to meet so many wonderful people and get to work with the organizations, even when they invite you to the dinners and they invite you to the events, and their appreciation. And that's what I love most. It's not just living in Southold, but it's living in Southold and being a public official in Southold. I just can't stress enough how wonderful the community has been to me. And that's probably wouldn't have been available up west. An elected official up west gets to know a lot of people, but those towns are so big, they don't get to know everybody. And in Southold, certainly there's plenty I don't know, but an awful lot I do.
Mm-hmm.
An awful lot I do. And not just know them, but know them pretty well. Sometimes that's not an easy thing, but by and large, it's a real privilege.
And just looking to the future, what do you hope for the town of Southold down the line for its community and people?
What I hope for the future is that Southold as little change as possible. I know that sounds almost close-minded and small-minded, but I'm hoping for as little change as possible. And I'm hoping that there, rather than replacing Southold with what someone's own romantic notion is of what it should be, I'm hoping people embrace Southold for what it is. And it's more than just open space. It's more than just clean beaches. There's an awful lot about Southold. And there's a lot of wonderful people that are out here that have been living out here a long time. And it's, you know what? You want to know what it's like living in Southold? Go to a fire department event. That's what it's like living in Southold. Go to a fire department event. Go to a real, hometown. These are people that are proud of their fire department. They're proud of their community. I was lucky enough to recently be the Grand Marshal in Greenport Fire Department, the Washington Days Parade. Just go into that firehouse and hang out and see the pride that they all have in being in that department and being from Greenport. That's what's really special, more than anything in Southold town.
And just lastly, now that you decided not to run again for Southold Town Supervisor, what have you been doing now in your spare time? Do you have any hobbies, or are you working on anything else?
I have a lot that keeps me busy. I was trying to figure out whether I wanted to stay in government or not, take another government position, but there's, I think, probably a great deal in the private sector that's going to keep me busy. It's already keeping me pretty busy. With regard to hobbies and things, I'm actually getting things done. I'm taking my time before I jump right back into the fire. I'm taking time getting things done that I've been wanting to get done for a long time. But when you have a job that you have days and nights that call you out, it's very difficult. So it seems mundane, but hey, spring's right around the corner. I want to get out there now and get all the invasive species out of the garden before it grows and kills all my flowers again. I want to do those things. I spent a couple of very, very nice days gardening, and I loved it. I haven't been able to do that in 2 or 3 years, because what happens is that things come and go. Next thing you know, your garden's been overrun. So, I'm enjoying that. At the same time, having a lot of conversations with a lot of people in terms of where I'm going to go. So,
Wonderful.
Yeah, it's I'll be just fine.
And I just asked everyone if there was anything else you wanted to discuss or say that we haven't covered, or
I can't think of anything. What I want to make sure look, there's a new board, there's a new supervisor. I don't want to be one of those people that keeps chirping in. It's time to move on. If the paper calls and asks my opinion, I'm going to give it because it's my nature. But by and large, it's over. It's not my time anymore. But it doesn't mean people can't feel free to ask me a question or to call me. Or if they think I can help them in any way, please feel free. I want you to still keep coming up to me at King Cullen, because I'll still try to help you. And if I can't help you, I probably know someone at Town Hall that's really, really good at what they do, and that's really, really would be happy to help you. So feel free. My time in local government is done, but my time in helping the local community is not done, and it never will be. So,
well, I want to thank you so much for coming onto the podcast today and all you've done for the community and your love for the town of Southold and your service. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me today.
Well, I hope you enjoyed episode 35 with former Southold Town Supervisor Scott Russell. I want to thank you for listening to the Floyd Memorial Library podcast, and we'll see you next time.